everyone. Welcome to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my colleague, Sarah Yanosy. Hi, good morning,
Hi.
Sarah.
Good morning, Sandy.
Sarah and I have developed an organizational intervention to help organizations, with a particular emphasis on leaders of organization, to integrate trauma-informed practice using the acronym PRESENCE. And it stands for Partnership and Power, Reverence and Restoration, Emotional Wisdom and Empathy, Safety and Social Responsibility, Embodiment and Enactment, Nature and Nurture, Culture and Complexity, and Emergence and Evolution. Today, Sarah and I are going to describe a little about the underpinning of this program, Creating Presence.
So, Sandy, when we talk about the primary elements of using trauma-informed practice, we always start with the recognition of the need to change the fundamental question from what's wrong with you to what's happened to you. Why is that so important?
Yeah, well, one of the important things in medicine, when you go to see a doctor about some symptoms that you're having, it's the doctor has to figure out what's wrong with you. But if it's your stomach or your kidneys or your lungs, some part of your body that's not functioning properly, it may really be perfectly obvious why that part is not working, or the doctor will order tests and try and figure it out. Thing is, though, when we're talking about mental health, with some problem with our thinking or our behavior, or especially our feelings, we're no longer actually looking at a part of us. We're really looking at the whole person. So where do you even begin when the problem may involve every part of a person's whole life? So for many decades, even really centuries, in mental health, we've been pretending that emotional problems are like medical problems. So we have this really complex diagnostic scheme that called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM. It's now up to its 5th version with amendments, I think. And each diagnosis then has a bunch of symptoms listed. So if you're a psychiatrist like me, then you'll have to use that list, and I'll make a conclusion about you. Oh, you have a major depressive disorder, or you have a borderline personality disorder, or you have schizophrenia, or you have an anxiety disorder. But the DSM is just a bunch of symptoms. It doesn't help very much figuring out, well, why? Why do I have those symptoms? And what does it really mean? I mean, it may be a good description for me, but why am I that way? So with each diagnosis that's in that book, there are many, many theories about the why, but none of them are really definitive and really help people understand what they're supposed to do, whether it's the patient or the family or the therapist. It's not any guidelines for what you do. But this is what we were all taught to do. If you want to get your mental health service covered by insurance, a diagnosis from the DSM will be mandatory. And me and my team, we played this game too, until we had our first experience with treating people we knew well, but who completely surprised us when we found out that really bad things had happened to them. And finally, and it was only then that the symptoms that they had began actually to make sense to us and to them. They had experienced all different kinds of childhood adversity and other forms of trauma. And once we understood, we had to study this, but once we understood how traumatic experiences affect the mind and the body and the behavior and really the soul of a person, what became much more important than any of the diagnostic terminology was finding out what had happened to them. And along the way, we discovered that their symptoms originated really as coping skills, as ways to cope with all the bad things that had happened to them. And everything started to make sense.
You're reminding me, Sandy, of a training I took very recently at my organization about writing clinical progress notes for insurance companies so that they will be approved. And I was really surprised to learn, I shouldn't have been, but I was surprised to learn that most places are using AI and so artificial intelligence to check notes. And the primary thing that the AI is tracking or looking for is medical necessity. And that means listing the symptoms. And so, making progress in resolving those symptoms, not
Oh,
super
good.
important, right? Not really helpful in the documentation. Thinking complexly about exactly what you're describing, what's causing the symptoms or what we need to do in order to really impact change, not as important as sort of just listing, what's happening, what's wrong. And really that medical model focuses so much on what's wrong with you.
Right. Exactly. And it's a huge barrier to actually delivering good care because it misleads people. They don't know about really how to move things along. And you don't want to show that there's any progress because then it won't be covered anymore. That's crazy.
Right.
It's
Right.
insane.
Yeah. Well, the acronym presence is, organized around a set of values. And we sort of used these values as a framework for making sense of how to move forward in a trauma informed way. Why do you think it's so important to use a values driven perspective?
Well,
What's that about?
you just illustrated why it's so incredibly important because in what you were just talking about, the only value is making money. It's not about whether people are actually making progress and whether it's working. The whole trauma informed thing, or what we really prefer to think of as trauma responsive care, it's a huge paradigm shift for all of our educational and helping institutions and our justice institutions, and for the leaders who lead all of these. It requires this radical shift in our mental models, which are really the unconscious, often culturally determined ideas that underneath the surface inform everything that we do and that we think. The last really big paradigm shift, just so everybody knows, was when the scientific revolution began in the 1600s. So when it
That's
comes
a
to
long
understand
time ago.
a really long time ago, and when it comes to understanding human nature, really understanding it, because we haven't, this one, the trauma responsive revolution, is really the next one. Because mental models determine what ideas and beliefs and values guide what we think about and what we do. And this kind of the thing about it is this kind of change is very scary for people and for whole organizations. So to keep on track, we have to have a set of values that everybody agrees on that helps us construct really what has got to be a new definition of our reality, including what human nature is really about.
Yeah, Sandy, I think it might be useful for us to describe the difference between trauma informed and trauma responsive. And even that is a paradigm shift because there's been some buy-in around this idea of being trauma informed, but that sort of means knowing, right? Informed means having information, having knowledge. And when you and I have been talking about what this work really means, and when we started creating presence, what we highlighted and what felt so important to us was not just understanding the information, but knowing what to do with it, how to
Exactly.
apply it, how do we respond to what we're seeing in a way that's aligned with these values that you were just describing.
Exactly. So all of those values are associated with skills that we teach our organizational leaders and everybody else in the organization. So from your perspective, how do the organizations using creating presence, how do they relate to the acronym and to the idea of changing that fundamental question from what's happened to you, from what's wrong with you to what's happened to you?
I think the biggest thing that I see is it allows the emergence of compassion, humanizing, and normalizing what we see in behaviors. And that really makes a big difference because I think everyone that I talk to sort of thinks that their organization is the only one that's as messed up as it is. And so when we're able to say, well, no, this is just how our brains work. And how our brains are responding to all of the stressors and all of the things that have happened to each of us as individuals, and also what's happened in our organization, what's happened to us collectively. And in that way, I think the pandemic has been a really helpful flashpoint for making that connection. The light bulbs really go on for people when we talk about that. The other thing that I think is so helpful, is in the treatment arena when we are talking with direct service providers and clinicians and helping them change the question and seeing client behavior in a completely different way. Really also being able to bring that humanizing, normalizing, and compassion based perspective. Um, but I also see some really interesting things with regard to how people relate to the acronym itself. And it's long, Sandy. It's it's 8 letters with 2 different concepts attached to each of the
I
letters. Like
know.
it's a little, it's a little cumbersome. But what I think is really powerful about it, despite, its length and cumbersomeness, is that, we sort of use a more like resonant perspective rather than like a memorizing perspective. So when I'm describing the acronym and talking about the concepts, my expectation is not that people are going to memorize these 16 words and sort of walk around, repeating them to themselves and integrating them that way. It's really about what resonates for you. And so what's really interesting is all of the components of the acronym are powerful and important and impactful for everyone at every level. However, there are certain letters that really connect with different people in different roles. Leaders really connect with partnership and power and culture and complexity. It's this like really interesting dynamic that happens when leaders start to understand like, oh, I need to think about my own use of power. I need to think about how what I do is affecting the entire organizational culture. And so that's really where I see the biggest connection happening for leaders. For clinicians, similarly, there are 2 letters that really connect for them, and those are embodiment and enactment and nature and nurture. It's like really understanding patterns and how the information they learn about what's happened to people in the past is showing up in the present, and how clients are embodying their trauma every day. With nature and nurture, it's about recognizing the impact of relationships, and that's what clinical work is. For direct service providers, I think emotional wisdom and empathy is where one of the light bulbs goes off. And then, of course, safety and social responsibility, because the direct service providers are the ones who are having the most contact, most connection with clients. And then for indirect providers, it's reverence and restoration and emergence and evolution, because issues around feeling respected and thinking about their place in the future of the organization, that's what makes the most powerful impact. So that's sort of what I've been seeing. Um, and we will take a quick break, and we want to thank you for listening to Creating Presence. Coming up after the break, Sandy and I will continue our discussion and talk more specifically about skills for using trauma-informed practice. We'll be right back.
In a world with trauma, adversity, and mental health deficits, your organization may be feeling the effects in its culture. Recognizing the need for safe, productive, and values-aligned organizations, Creating Presence can help to develop a healthy, biocratic organization. In the Creating Presence training model, your entire staff will learn to value human elements that characterize organizations, learn values that are solution-based and supportive, and implement new skills which will create capable leaders to meet the needs of staff and clients. For more information, go to www.creatingpresence.net. Creating Presence is managed by Lakeside, your resource for trauma-responsive care.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom. I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy, and we're talking today about trauma responsive care and why it's important and kind of what the meme, "It's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you," really means, and how the values of creating presence all help support the work that we all do. I took the lead in mapping out the values component of creating presence, but Sarah, you focused on organizing the skills. Could you share your thinking about how the skills are organized and why we focus on those specific categories?
Yes. So the first thing I want to say is, in our conversations, it became really clear that we needed this to be action oriented, right? To build on the knowledge and move from just being trauma informed to trauma responsive. And it seemed like skills were a really helpful way of building that bridge. And when we started to think about like what are the skills that are most useful and most helpful, felt important to think about the areas of disruption for people when they've been exposed to trauma or stress or adversity over periods of time. Um, and four themes really emerged. And so that those became the categories that we organized our skills in. And those categories are brain regulation, communication, engagement, and complexity management. And with brain regulation, I mean, it's really science-based. When we are triggered by a stressor, our amygdalas take over and our brains go into fight, flight, or freeze or fawn response, and we are not able to function at our best. And so being able to practice brain regulation skills really helps just put us in the right mindset to do this work and to engage with people. In the communication category, what we also see or recognize is that when we're triggered, we often respond in ways that can be perceived as hostile, aggressive, punitive. We're also really prone to misinterpreting or distorting what other people say. And that's again due to the amygdala activation, right? That fight flight part of our brains. And so building communication skills is really important. Engagement, well, that's a problem area too. Stress impacts our ability to relate to other people. Again, very much on that fight or flight response. We have a hard time when we've had repeated exposure to trauma to trust people. Trusting and connecting and allowing ourselves to be authentic and engage with other people is an area of disruption when we're under stress or when especially when we've been exposed to trauma. So we want to focus on engagement skills. And then the last is complexity management. And this one sounds kind of fancy, but it's really about avoiding oversimplification. When we're, again, that amygdala, that stinking amygdala gets us every time. It is, when it's triggered, it takes the energy away from the front part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, where our reasoning lives and happens. And all of the energy is happening, and all the neurons are firing in the back of our brains. And that leads us to very quick decisions, very hard to make thoughtful, considered solutions when we're in that fight or flight response. So being able to, at the organizational and personal level, just take a step back, use the brain regulation skills, get ourselves back in our prefrontal cortex thinking, and then use some specific strategies in order to appreciate that complexity and get to those more sophisticated solutions. The category of complexity management really grew out of conversations about neuroscience. What do we know, Sandy, about our brains that make this so important?
Yeah, you've touched on that, on how the amygdala is so important, just as one little tiny little pea-shaped thing that determines so much of our behavior. We respond automatically to any kind of stress, uh, to threat or danger. So it doesn't matter about whether it is really dangerous. Those are survival responses that are really deeply embedded automatically in our unconscious awareness. The problem is that most of the things that really stress us in our modern life are not really dangerous. And yet our heart rate goes up, and the higher our heart rate, the less able we are to think, and the less able we are to do anything that requires complex interactions. Our blood pressure goes up. The quality of our thinking really goes down the tubes. And we express all kinds of emotions that can lead to a wide variety of interpersonal conflicts that may or may not be appropriate to the situation because they're happening automatically. So the reason why developing skills is so important is that we have to be able to consciously know what's happening to us, be able to spot what's triggering us, what's making us so upset, and be able to manage all that. And in modern life, that is an incredibly complex process because there are many, many demands put upon us every day that contradict each other. So we need to know how to identify all that because it's all happening automatically in our brains. And that's what I think it's hard to understand, that we don't have nearly as much control as we'd like to think we do. And so to be able to identify all that's happening and continue to be able to think in the presence of it, if you're going to lead an organization, if you're going to supervise other people, you have to be able to do that. And it doesn't matter what system you're in. It doesn't matter whether you're, a doctor who's in the ER, or a social worker in a program, or a police officer out on the streets. You have to be able to manage these automatic responses that are normal, but in modern times, they're not, we're not responding to actually events that we need to respond to in that way most of the time. So I want to ask you more about these group engagement and communication skills, and what it looks like on the ground.
Yeah. So with group engagement, I'll back up a little bit. I think we talk about group engagement skills But even before group engagement skills, we need to think just about general engagement. And it feels to me like a flashback to a conversation you and I had like almost 25 years ago when we first met. And you said, a lot of this practice is aligned with that book, Everything I Needed to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. And we have sort of a complex, sophisticated process that we're using, but underneath that are really those fundamentals, things like recognizing how to be courteous. And so in some of the work that we're doing around group engagement, it's also just interpersonal engagement. So reflecting on the norms that we set up for how people interact with each other, and they can be really simple things. I'm thinking about an organization that I work with where one of the changes that they made was just in shifting the little cart that they use, where they roll the cart in with the laptop to every patient, area in the emergency department. And somebody's standing there and typing, and there's like this computer screen between the provider and the person. And they very simply made it a practice of standing near the person, next to the person, so that that person can see the screen, and then turning and asking the questions to the person directly. And that made such a difference. It
Yeah.
sounds so simple, but I actually had this experience yesterday because I had to get my blood pressure checked for my physical. And it was just really helpful when the nurse practitioner who I see, sort of was showing me the screen, and she was like, and this is what I'm looking at. And I felt included in a different way. And I don't know that she knew she was using trauma-informed engagement skills, but she totally was. So those are some of the foundation pieces, but then we also look at sort of this at the organizational level. So one of the significant skills that we work on for group engagement is about building consensus. And I think this is really helpful and important, not just for leaders to use, but for staff members to understand as participants, because there's so much siloing and so much us them thinking that emerges when we are in situations, and organizations are rife with these situations where there are different levels and layers of authority and decision making. So building consensus is something we're not used to and not very adept at yet in organizations, because for the most part, we just assume that people who have power are going to make the decisions and then tell everyone else what they're going to do. And then leaders are often really frustrated and puzzled when people don't do it, or don't do it the way that they are expected to do it, or they complain about it. And so the skill that we teach around this is how to build consensus. So we work towards helping people learn how to use this consensus building process. And what that looks like is, not voting, because voting is a pretty flawed way of making decisions, especially when you have a smaller group of leaders and a bigger group of staff. We know what that's going to look like at the end of the day. But what building consensus means is giving people language to describe what is important to them, what their priorities are, and then moving through a process where not everyone comes out of the negotiation or conversation feeling like, yes, this is perfect, but everyone leaves saying, I can live with this. And often what happens when decisions are made without consensus is you have a group of people who feel like they cannot live with it, and they end up making that known. sometimes by just saying it loudly, and sometimes through their actions. And so using that consensus building process really shifts the focus to shared ownership. And we have so much more buy-in and so much more alignment when we're using a process where people feel that they have some voice and choice. And so this engagement skill is really about creating that process and having a formalized way of getting there rather than a, sort of top-down decision-making process. And that's not to say that every single decision should be made by consensus or has to be made by consensus, but when there is an opportunity to include people who are going to be impacted by a decision, to have a voice in how that decision is made, it really changes the dynamic. And then you end up with fewer of those meetings after the meeting, right? Where people are, given some information and they absorb it quietly and nod in agreement and then leave, go out to the parking lot, and everyone's standing around saying like, we can't do this. It's never going to work. And so building consensus as a group engagement skill is really helpful. And even if you aren't able to to do that with staff members, even doing it as a leadership team, using a consensus model for making decisions within a leadership team, that can be really powerful and have ripple effects as well, positive ripple effects.
It's the real practice of democracy on the ground.
Yeah, exactly. And then in thinking about communication skills, I think one that really stands out for me is the language of interest. And this is very similar to the process of building consensus, but a little different because it focuses on how we talk with each other and how we structure or organize conflict. And so what it really boils down to is recognizing that we have developed over time two primary ways of negotiating, and they are pretty brain based, right? They're sort of in that fight or flight mentality. So often when we find ourselves in conflict with someone, we will either rely on what we call language of power, which is about, like who has more authority, because I said so. Like when I am momming, I am really leaning into my power and authority in ways that I do not like about myself. And that's kind of what the language of power is all about. And then the other is the language of justice. And my kids are really, I find them very, engaged in that language, which is like, mommy, that's not fair. That's not fair. That's not fair. Everything is not fair. And so you sort of end up in this, back and forth about because I said so, that's not fair. That's not fair. That because I said so dynamic, and it doesn't get us anywhere. And so we look at instead is how to find common interest. And again, it's similar to building consensus. It's about understanding priorities and what's important to someone, and really thinking about ways that we can communicate our needs and the reasons for our decisions in ways that help everybody feel like they won. So we're going to take another break. And when we come back, we'll be talking about what a safety culture looks like. So thanks so much for listening. We'll be right back.
If you want to develop a trauma-responsive culture within your organization, your leaders must be able to be knowledgeable and possess the skills to create positive change. Creating Presence, developed by world-renowned Dr. Sandra Bloom, offers an online training and coaching process that will help leaders become capable to cultivate a safe, productive, and values-aligned environment for your staff and clients. For more information, go to www.creatingpresence.net. Creating Presence is managed by Lakeside, your resource for trauma-responsive care.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy. And we're talking today about trauma-responsive care, why it's important, and what the meme, "it's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you," really means, and how the values of creating presence all help support the work that we all do.
One of the core elements in creating presence is establishing a safety culture. Sandy, what does that mean? And what does it look like to operate in a safety culture?
Yeah, it's interesting because when people hear the word safety, they usually only think about basic physical safety. And of course, that's where we get into a lot of trouble as a whole society because an exclusive focus on physical safety, where does that lead? It leads to an endless search for more and bigger guns and weapons, more and more security officers. And yet at the same time, somewhat paradoxically, there's less and less real safety. So we live in this culture where nobody really feels safe for very long. So what's that about? And I think it's because of the definition of safety that um, we need to actually focus on 5 domains of safety if we're really going to be safe. And yes, you have to start with physical safety. So if you're in an inpatient environment, say, you do have to feel physically safe. It has to be physically safe for people to make any improvement or get healthier. Any organization, that's true. So I'm not saying that there shouldn't be security measures. Not in the world we live in. We need them. It's just that it's not enough. We have to also feel psychologically safe, which is safe with ourselves and our thoughts and our emotions and our beliefs, which is really challenging because, as we know, so many people, most people in the United States are going to experience a traumatic event. And most people in the United States will have experienced some form of childhood adversity. So you can't take for granted that people feel safe with themselves, or that they even know how to do that. So when we look at all of the issues of substance abuse and self-harming behavior, that's all about the psychological safety is really jeopardized. And then there's social safety. So it was what you were just talking about in the last segment. It's so vital that we are able to be safe with each other, which means we need a lot of skills to do that. We don't just automatically get along, not in our culture. We go for conflict, and there's a lot of it at every level, in every way. Conflict is everywhere. And so we have to really work on this issue of social safety because we are not living in a socially safe culture. It's, at least if you're trying to work on these aspects of safety in an organization, you stand a chance of achieving it, but it's still quite hard. And then there's moral safety. Woo. Safe within a system of values and meaning. And so people often think that, oh, that's religion. Well, religion is one aspect of moral safety, but a lot of people have contradictory religious beliefs with each other. So we can't just count on it being religion and religious values. We've got to share values together and decide together what those are going to be. And that's why presence is what it is. And then cultural safety is we need safety and respect within our various cultures. And by culture, that can mean anything. As a elderly woman, that's one culture. As a woman, we're both inside of that. As you know, white people, we have a culture. Black people have a culture. Hispanic people have a culture. Every organization has a culture. Every community has a culture. Every part of the country has a culture. I mean, oh, and we do not have cultural safety now. So that in an organization, that's what people, if they want to have a safe organization, they have to look at all 5 domains of safety, figure out where there's a leak, where there's a vulnerability, and start taking some steps to actually create more safety. But I want to ask you, what are the skills that leaders and staff need to build, and what do they think are the risks that you're seeing in the organizations that have adopted creating presence? What are the risks that they have to take to actually put those skills to use?
So it's interesting. The risks, I think, are really about tolerating vulnerability and willingness to develop insight and do some self-reflection as leaders. And that can be really scary. And what they need to be able to do in order to be effective at using trauma-informed and trauma-responsive practices really goes back to what you just said about conflict. And so I think what we have found really effective is working with leaders to build that insight through self-reflection and tolerating the vulnerability that goes along with that by really helping them assess their leadership style. And one thing that we look at is, what comes most naturally to you and what does your team need? And do those things line up? Because often they don't, right? Sometimes people find that they are in a more, uh, authoritarian kind of leadership role. And that, that's what feels most comfortable for them, being in charge, telling people what to do, having people follow the rules. And I know my wife was in the army, so that is a very comfortable role for her to take. It's also very comfortable for her when other people take that role. Like that's normal for her. For me, that's awful. I hate it. And so, it's really important to think about, what are other possibilities? I know for me, when I reflected, I sometimes take a more laissez-faire role as a leader when I have team members who have a lot of expertise and don't need a lot of engagement from me. Or I might take a more consultative leadership role where, I'm going around and asking people for feedback one at a time and then integrating that and coming to conclusions based on what I hear from other people. And then there's a more bureaucratic kind of leadership style. And some people are very comfortable with that. It's like, well, this is what it says in the handbook. So this is how it is. And there are times and places for all of those different styles, and they're very appropriate at different points in time. And so as leaders, we have to be able to maneuver through those roles. And also we want to be able to engage in a leadership style that really brings people into the decision-making process with us. And that's a lot harder to do. Those other roles that I just identified are sort of more common for people. Having the ability to really embody transformational leadership or a more integrated leadership style is harder. So that's one of the skills that we try to work on. Another skill is around conflict. And really, there are three things that we focus on. One is recognizing the difference between task conflict and interpersonal conflict. And this, I learned this from you, Sandy. Um, really understanding that task conflict is good. We want people to like hash it out and, kind of go at it in a really meaty, juicy way when they're trying to figure out the best solution to a problem or the best course of action, and really getting heated and excited about that. That's really good conflict. A lot of people are very uncomfortable with conflict. So we want to sort of change the narrative to understand that some conflict is really good. I know as a leader, for me, I feel like whenever I've had a conflict with someone, I come out of that feeling closer, like when it's resolved, obviously. If it doesn't go well and doesn't come to a resolution, not so much. But the experience of being able to safely have a conflict is so important in connecting. So teaching our leaders how to do that, how to create that safety for conflict and really encourage task conflict while being able to steer away from interpersonal conflict, which is really more about disrespect and territoriality, violations of emotional safety or social safety. And then knowing what your conflict style is, that's another really important thing that we have to help build with leaders. Some variations of conflict styles are competing, right? People get really competitive when they're in a conflict. Avoiding is another one, like dipping out and not participating at all. I, refer to that one as like taking your ball and going home. There's accommodating, which is another conflict style, which is basically saying like, okay, fine, whatever you want, just like, let's just make this stop. Or a collaborating style. That's what we really want to help people build the skill at, becoming a conflict collaborator, rather than, using some of these other conflict styles. And then the last one is really about understanding how you communicate. And again, I really like the idea of whole brain communication. This was something that I learned about in business school, and really understanding like, are you a big picture thinker? Are you more focused on feelings? Are you more attuned to details, or are you more attuned to like an analytical process? And whichever one of those you lean towards really shapes how you communicate. And I'm sure it will be no surprise to you, Sandy, like details and analytical thinking are not my thing. So really knowing what my limitations are and what I need to build up and do differently when I communicate, really important. And so those are some of the areas that we try to focus on with leaders. But you've had some experience as a leader and leading a team in a safety culture. What's that been like? What does it look like? What have you learned?
Yeah, you made me think, you made me have a lot of memories because I had a adult inpatient unit for 20 years. And I was thinking about how important it was for us to really have um, a staff that was diverse. And by diverse, I don't mean necessarily based on the color of somebody's skin. I mean, all of that, all those conflict styles. So once we knew each other's styles, we could have a patient that was very avoidant and suppressed and would never experience, and she would, I'm never angry, one of those people while they're cutting themselves.
Yes.
And we could send one of our staff members in and say, tonight he's on 3 to 11. Could you go work with her? Because he was so good at arousing anger in people. And the next day I'd come in and she'd say, I'm so angry. Yeah, okay, good. You've got something to work with. To lead a safety culture, you really have to do your best not to be a hypocrite. That's the hardest part, I think. You have to walk the talk. And I focused my attention on trying as best I could to live my principles with everybody on my team. So we had regular meetings, and it's this that often goes down the tubes under the stress of our current environments. But we would meet, all of us, twice a week. And it would be all the doctors, the nurses, the line staff, the creative therapists, everybody that was involved in treatment. And we'd sit around a table and we would go over every single person that was with us, and figure out what progress had they made, what was going on, what did somebody know that the rest of us didn't know. And we would have one of those meetings in the morning for the day staff, and the second one during the week would be in the afternoon, so we could get the evening staff. The night staff, we couldn't do much about, except inform them through a nursing supervisor, and we did that. So each of those meetings would be at least an hour and a half. And it was the objective was to really do the integrative work that is absolutely necessary to make treatment effective. And I think now it's really very rare. In fact, what's even more rare are any programs that were like ours. They were all shut down in the early 1990s because of changes in the overall environment. Everything now is about doing things faster and faster with fewer and fewer costs. And of course, it doesn't work. If we are not going to invest in keeping people safe when they're young, then we're guaranteed we're going to pay later as a society. So as a leader, it was those decisions that were being made above me that were my biggest challenges and that ultimately defeated me. For the sake of saving money, the hospital administrators felt that they needed to do things and make changes that I believed were fundamentally unsafe. So as a result, we had to keep moving our program despite it was very therapeutic and financially successful at the time. We had to move 4 times and then finally close it. This is long before there was any talk of trauma-informed care. And making those decisions puts a terrible stress on any leader that is involved, both at the administrative level and at the level I was at, because you have to satisfy such conflicting demands. And I don't know what the solution to that is, except to try to create as much as possible your own safety culture and move away from shame and blame and normalize conflict and get people to really do the work so they can have the experience of their work being really effective and thereby reduce burnout and secondary traumatic stress.
Thanks so much for listening to Creating Presence. Join us next week when Sandy and I will look at the risks for treating organizations like they're machines and how to think of them more as living systems. You can reach us at creatingpresence.net or voiceamerica.com. See you next week.